A silk pouch of 10,000 gold guineas hits a mahogany table. Hard. The sound fills the room like a verdict. The woman standing on the other side of that table does not move. She does not gasp. She does not reach for it. She simply looks at it the way a person looks at something that is very far beneath them. And that stillness, that unbothered, unshakable stillness, should have told the Dowager Duchess of Aldermere everything she needed to know. But pride is a blindfold, and the Dowager had been wearing hers for a very long time. 10,000 guineas, the Dowager says, her voice smooth as polished marble, cold as the floor beneath their feet. And the deed to a property in the north. Take it, disappear, and never speak my son's name again. She leans forward just slightly and adds the part she has clearly been saving. You are a stain, child, a nobody, and nobodies do not get to stand beside dukes. The woman across the table lets the insult land. She does not flinch, does not argue, does not beg. She picks up the deed. She picks up the gold. She bows slowly, deliberately, and she walks out. The Dowager smiles. She believes she has won. She has never been more wrong in her entire life. But here is what the Dowager missed in that room, what her pride would not allow her to see. The bow that woman gave was not the curtsy of a social inferior offering submission. It was the measured incline of a sovereign acknowledging protocol. There is a difference, and it is the kind of difference that, before this story ends, will cost the Dowager everything she has ever held dear. Stay with this story, because what is about to unfold inside the walls of Aldermere will remind you that the most dangerous person in any room is never the loudest one. It is the one who already knows something you do not. This story is entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, or to actual places and events, is purely coincidental. Before we go any further, tell us in the comments where you are watching from right now. We have viewers joining from the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, Germany, and beyond, and we love knowing who is in the room with us. If you are new here, please subscribe to this channel. Stories like this one are what we do, powerful, layered, emotional, and always with something real to take away. You will not want to miss what comes next. This channel is built on persistence. Subscribe if you believe in persistence. And before we continue, just one question. If someone offered you gold to walk away from something you knew was yours, would you take it? Think about that, because Adriana already has her answer. The morning after that meeting in the marble study, the Dowager Duchess sat across from her son at breakfast in the east dining room of Harwick Hall. The room was beautiful in the way that old money makes things beautiful. Heavy drapes, silver on the table, a fire that had been lit before anyone in the household was awake, because that was simply how things were done at Harwick Hall. Order, propriety, appearances maintained at all times, even when no one was watching. The Dowager poured her tea with steady hands. She took the money, Julian. Duke Julian Aldermere looked up from his plate. Every last guinea. She took the deed as well. She was gone before the household stirred. The Dowager set the teapot down with quiet precision. I am sorry, my darling, but you must see now what she truly was. Julian said nothing for a long moment. The fire crackled. A footman stood near the door, eyes forward, trained in the particular art of being present without existing. I do not believe it, Julian said finally. The Dowager's expression did not change. Grief makes us want to believe the best of people who have already shown us otherwise. I said I do not believe it. He folded his napkin. He stood. He left the room. Now pay close attention here, because what Julian did next is the part of this story that separates genuine character from performance. And it is the part that Adriana, watching from a distance, would later say was the moment she made her decision. He searched for her, not loudly, not with announcements or declarations. Quietly, methodically, the way a man searches for something he cannot afford to lose. He sent private correspondence to trusted contacts across 3 counties. He made discreet inquiries through channels that a duke of his standing could access without drawing attention. He cancelled a dinner engagement with the Lord Lieutenant of Wiltshire, which in 1810 English society was the kind of social offence that people discussed for weeks. He arrived late to a gathering hosted by one of his mother's closest allies, offered no explanation, and left early. He did not believe his mother, and he refused to behave as though he did. In the Japanese tradition, there is a concept called makoto. It is one of those words that resists clean translation into English, because the English language was not built to hold everything it means. It describes a state of being in which a person's inner world and outer actions are perfectly aligned. No performance, no calculation, no behavior that changes depending on who is in the room. A person with makoto is the same person in private as they are in public, the same person in grief as they are in triumph. Julian had makoto. He searched for Adriana when there was no audience to witness his loyalty. He grieved for her when propriety demanded he simply move forward. He refused to believe the worst of someone he loved, in a world that made believing the worst the easiest and most socially acceptable option. That is not romance. That is character. And character, as this story will demonstrate, is the only currency that does not devalue. But here is where the story takes a darker turn. And here is where the audience must pay careful attention, because what the Dowager does next is something that has happened in real drawing rooms and real families across real history. Dressed in different clothes, but always recognizable at its core. She tightened her grip. The Aldermere estate, for all its grandeur, was in serious financial difficulty. Not because of any disaster, not because of any sudden misfortune, but because the Dowager Duchess had spent decades maintaining a lifestyle that the estate's actual income could not honestly support. Gala after gala, season after season in London, staff maintained at full complement. Appearances kept immaculate while the foundations quietly cracked. In the great noble houses of Regency England, this was not uncommon. Historians who have studied the financial records of aristocratic families from this period note that a significant number of estates were operating on debt so carefully managed and so elegantly concealed that even close family members did not know the true picture. The appearance of wealth was, in many cases, the last remaining asset. The Dowager had been managing this particular performance for 11 years, and now the curtain was threatening to fall. Her solution was the Baroness Cecily Hargrove of Bath, a woman of considerable inherited fortune, negligible warmth, and a precise understanding of what she was purchasing in seeking a match with a duke. The Baroness did not want love. She wanted a title, a seat at the highest table of English society, and the particular satisfaction of being addressed as Your Grace for the remainder of her days. The Dowager wanted the Baroness's money. It was, in its way, a perfectly practical arrangement. The kind of arrangement that had sustained aristocratic families across Europe for centuries. In the Habsburg courts of Austria, such negotiations were so formalized that they had their own legal terminology. In the noble houses of Castile and Spain, the merging of titles and fortunes through strategic marriage was considered not merely acceptable, but a patriotic duty. Sentiment was a luxury reserved for people who could afford it. The aristocracy, by and large, could not. The Dowager presented this to Julian with the same level composure she brought to everything. The family's survival depends on this match, she told him, seated in the same study where, 3 weeks earlier, she had laid a silk pouch on a mahogany table. The Hargrove fortune will settle every outstanding obligation. The Baroness is a woman of standing and means. You have a duty, Julian, not merely to yourself, but to every person whose livelihood depends on this estate, to the tenants, to the staff, to the name your father spent his life protecting. She paused. Adriana took the gold and left. The sooner you accept what that means, the sooner we can secure what remains. Julian looked at his mother for a long time, and then he agreed. Let the weight of that sit for a moment, because this is the part of the story that is hardest to watch and most important to understand. Julian did not agree because he stopped loving Adriana. He did not agree because he believed his mother. He agreed because in 1810, A duke did not simply carry his own name. He carried the names of everyone beneath that roof, everyone who worked that land, everyone whose safety and livelihood existed within the shadow of the Aldermere title. Sacrifice, real sacrifice, is almost never the dramatic gesture. It is almost never the grand moment witnessed by a crowd. It is the quiet agreement made in a private room. The decision to set aside what you want because something larger than your own wanting requires it. Julian made that agreement in silence, with no audience, with nothing to gain from the performance of nobility, because there was no performance at all. He simply bore it, and Adriana saw everything. From the palace, through channels and correspondences that the dowager could not have imagined existed, Adriana had been watching. She had watched Julian's search. She had watched him cancel engagements and arrive late, and refuse to accept the story he had been given. She had watched him grieve with the dignity of a man who did not know he was being observed. And now she watched him agree to a marriage he did not want, for reasons that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with the weight he had chosen to carry. She had traveled incognito through her own kingdom for one reason, not for adventure, not for sentiment, but because a sovereign who does not know the true character of the people she governs is not truly governing at all. She had wanted to see, without the distortion of ceremony and title, who was actually honorable in the realm she had inherited. She had her answer. The Grand Royal Gala was announced. The Dowager had organized it herself, as she organized everything, with precision and purpose. Aldermere House in London. Every significant family in the ton invited. The chandeliers would burn with 300 candles. Musicians from the continent had been engaged. And at the height of the evening, before the assembled cream of English aristocratic society, Julian would announce his engagement to the Baroness Cecily Hargrove of Bath. The Dowager had thought of everything. She had accounted for every variable. Every variable, that is, except one. The night of the gala arrived. London glittered. Carriages lined the street outside Aldermere House 3 deep, their lanterns reflected in the wet cobblestones below. Ladies in silk and gentlemen in tailored coats moved through the entrance in a river of propriety and perfume. The ballroom was everything the Dowager had designed it to be. Magnificent. Controlled. A stage built for exactly one outcome. Julian stood near the center of the room. His glass was full and untouched. His eyes moved to the entrance every few minutes, the way they had been doing for 3 weeks, the way a person's eyes move toward a door when some part of them still believes in the impossible. He had the silk pouch in his coat pocket, the one his mother had produced as evidence. He did not know why he had kept it. Propriety suggested he should have discarded it long ago. But he had not. He carried it the way people carry things they cannot yet bring themselves to put down. The Baroness stood nearby, correct and composed, already wearing the expression of a woman who considered the evening's outcome a settled matter. The Dowager moved through the room with the ease of a woman at the height of her power, greeting guests, accepting compliments, steering conversations, every inch the grande dame of English society. She did not notice the palace messenger who had arrived an hour earlier. She did not notice the quiet reconfiguration of the evening's formal program. She did not notice that the announcer at the entrance had been handed a scroll he had not been given at the start of the evening, and that his hands, as he unrolled it, were trembling. The trumpets sounded. 3 long notes. Too short. Every person in the room who knew what that sequence meant went very still. It was not a social fanfare. It was a royal salute. The Dowager turned toward the entrance, and for the first time in a very long evening, in a very long life of calculated composure, her face did something she had never permitted it to do in public. It lost its certainty. The announcer cleared his throat. The room was so silent that the sound carried to every corner of the ballroom, past the 300 burning candles, past the musicians who had lowered their instruments, past the Baroness Cecily Hargrove of Bath, whose composed expression was beginning, very slowly, to unravel at the edges. He read from the scroll. Her Most Sovereign Majesty, Queen Adriana, regnant of the realm. Nobody moved. Not one person in that ballroom moved. And then the doors opened. She was not in cotton. She was not in the simple, clean gown that the dowager had looked through as though it were made of air. She wore royal velvet the color of deep midnight, and the gold thread worked into its hem had been crafted by textile guilds in Lyon, France. The same guilds that had supplied the French and English courts for over a century, whose work was considered so fine that a single yard of their fabric cost more than a London seamstress earned in a year. Around her throat sat the eye of the realm, a diamond so historically significant, so tied to the identity of the crown, that its last public appearance had been at a coronation. Courtiers who had served in the palace for decades had seen it displayed behind glass. They had never expected to see it worn. On her head rested a crown that had not left the palace in 6 years. She walked the way that people walk when they are not performing confidence, but simply inhabiting it. No urgency, no theater. Each step measured and deliberate. The way a person moves when they know that every eye in the room is following them, and they feel nothing about that fact whatsoever. Every knee in the ballroom dropped. Not gradually. All at once, in the way that a field of wheat bends when the wind arrives. A sudden, collective, total submission. Ladies who had spent decades perfecting the art of the social curtsy sank lower than they ever had in their lives. Gentlemen who bowed to no one bowed completely. The Baroness Cecily Hargrove of Bath, who had arrived that evening expecting to leave as a future Duchess, folded into a curtsy so deep it was almost architectural. The Dowager Duchess Prudence of Aldermere sank as well. Her knees bent, her head dropped, and in the few seconds that her eyes were directed toward the polished ballroom floor, an entire lifetime of calculated supremacy collapsed into something that had no elegant name. She had miscalculated, not slightly, not in some minor detail that could be quietly corrected. She had miscalculated completely, irreversibly, and in front of every person in England whose opinion had ever mattered to her. Adriana walked past the curtsies, past the dropped heads, past the crumbling expressions of superiority that had, moments earlier, filled this room with the particular confidence of people who had never seriously questioned their own importance. She did not look at the Baroness. She did not look at the assembled ton. She did not look at Julian yet, though she was aware of exactly where he stood, aware of the untouched glass in his hand and the silk pouch in his coat pocket, and the expression on his face that she would not have been able to describe simply, because there are moments in a person's life that resist simple description. She stopped in front of the Dowager. The Dowager was still in her curtsy. Protocol required that she remain so until acknowledged. Adriana let the moment hold for precisely long enough that everyone in the room understood what was happening. And then she spoke, quietly, in a voice calibrated for the Dowager alone, though the silence of the room carried it everywhere. "Rise." The Dowager straightened. Her face had recovered some of its composure. Not all, but some. She was, whatever else could be said of her, a woman who had spent a lifetime managing difficult situations, and some part of that training was still operational even now. Even here, even in the wreckage of everything she had built. Adriana reached into the folds of her royal gown. She produced the silk pouch. She set it on the small side table beside the Dowager's champagne glass with the same quiet precision with which it had been placed in front of her 3 weeks ago in that cold marble study. Then she placed the deed to Fenwick Grange beside it, the deed to the crumbling estate in Northumberland that the Dowager had offered as a one-way passage into obscurity. The room watched. Nobody breathed. "You offered me 10,000 guineas, Adriana said, and the deed to an estate in the north. You told me to disappear from your son's life." A pause. Brief. Surgical. "You did not realize that I own every inch of land you are currently standing on. Every estate, every title, every deed in this kingdom traces its authority back to the crown, the ground beneath Harwick Hall, the ground beneath this ballroom, the ground beneath every property attached to the name Aldermere." Another pause. "All of it is mine." She let that settle. Then she turned and looked at Julian. He had not moved from the center of the ballroom. He was standing exactly where he had been standing when the trumpet sounded. But the untouched glass was no longer in his hand, and the expression on his face had shifted into something that a painter might have spent a lifetime trying to capture and still not gotten quite right. He was looking at her the way a person looks when two entirely separate understandings arrive at exactly the same moment. The understanding of who someone is, and the understanding of how much that person already knew about who he was. He still had the silk pouch in his coat pocket. His hand moved to it without thinking. A reflex. The way the hand moves toward the thing it has been carrying when the reason for carrying it finally becomes clear. "Your son," Adriana said, still looking at Julian, her voice carrying now to the whole room, "is the only entirely honest man in this room. He searched for someone he loved when there was nothing to gain from searching. He refused to believe the worst of a person in a world that made believing the worst the easiest available option. He agreed to sacrifice his own happiness for the welfare of people depending on his name, and he did it in private, without audience, without the performance of nobility." She turned back to the dowager. "That is not a man who needs to be managed. That is a man who deserved the truth." The dowager said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Now here is where history and this story stand in the same room together. Because what Adriana did next had a precedent. In the court of Holy Roman Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, who ruled from 1740 and was considered one of the most formidable sovereigns in European history, there is a documented pattern of the empress personally confronting nobles who had overstepped their authority, not through legal proceedings first, but through direct personal address in public settings. The public nature of the confrontation was itself the consequence. It was not cruelty. It was clarity. It removed the possibility of the offending party rewriting the story later, because the story had been witnessed by too many people to be quietly revised. Adriana understood this principle. The dowager's consequence was not delivered in a private letter. It was not communicated through a legal intermediary. It was delivered here, in this ballroom, in front of everyone whose respect the dowager had spent her life cultivating. Before the season ended, the Dowager Duchess Prudence of Aldermere was formally stripped of her titles. In the Spanish court tradition of the same era, this kind of fall from grace had a name, Queda en Desgracia, a descent so complete that even a person's former allies stopped using their name in conversation, not out of cruelty, but out of the particular social instinct that causes people to distance themselves from anyone the crown has visibly withdrawn its favor from. The dowager was not imprisoned. She was not publicly shamed beyond what that evening had already accomplished. She was simply reduced, returned to the life of a private woman of modest means, in a society that had no further use for her performance. She moved to a small house in the countryside. She received no more invitations. She hosted no more galas. The world she had spent everything maintaining continued without her, as worlds always do. The Baroness Cecily Hargrove of Bath left the gala that evening in her carriage, said nothing publicly, and was reportedly seen at a spa in Bath within the fortnight, which suggested that she had recalibrated her expectations with impressive efficiency and moved on entirely. Julian was not given a reward in the way that word is usually understood. He was given something rarer and more durable. He was seen fully, without flattery, without the distortion that rank and ceremony produce, by someone with the position and the perception to see anyone they chose, and he was chosen anyway, not for his title, not for his estate, not for what he could offer a strategic alliance, but for what he had done when no one he believed was watching. She appointed him royal consort. In the royal courts of Europe, the title of consort carried enormous weight. It was not subordinate, exactly, but complementary, a recognition that the person beside the sovereign was not decoration but partnership. In the Danish royal tradition, the consort was described using a term that translated roughly as the one who walks alongside, which captured something that the English title alone did not fully convey. It was not about who held the power. It was about who had earned the place beside it. Julian had earned it in a private breakfast room when he stood up from the table and said, "I do not believe it." He had earned it in 3 weeks of quiet searching. He had earned it in a silk pouch he could not bring himself to discard. Adriana addressed the court before the evening concluded, not with the length of a formal speech, not with the apparatus of a royal proclamation, with one line, spoken clearly, in a room full of people who had just discovered that the world was considerably larger and more complicated than their assumptions had permitted them to believe. "True nobility," she said, "is not what you are given at birth. It is what you refuse to sell." The 10,000 guineas from the silk pouch were donated, by royal decree, to the restoration of 3 parish churches in Northumberland whose congregations had been maintaining crumbling buildings for generations without the means to repair them. The deed to Fenwick Grange was returned to the families of tenant farmers who had worked that land across 4 generations without ever holding a legal claim to it. 2 gestures, small in the accounting of a crown, enormous in the lives of the people they reached. And the dowager, sitting alone in a hired carriage moving through the dark streets of London that night, held nothing. No title, no plan, no performance left to maintain. Just the memory of a woman she had looked through in a cold marble study, had called a nobody, had handed gold to as though gold were the final word on what a person was worth. And the very slow, very cold understanding of how catastrophically wrong she had been. Not because the woman had been a queen, but because she had treated her as though she were nothing before she knew what she was. And that in any era, in any country, in any court from London to Vienna to Madrid, is the kind of error that cannot be undone. The dowager had not simply misjudged a person's rank. She had revealed her own character. And character, once revealed in public, is permanent. The ballroom emptied slowly, the way ballrooms do after something historic has occurred inside them. People moved toward the doors in smaller groups than they had arrived in, speaking quietly, already beginning the process of turning what they had witnessed into the story they would tell tomorrow and next week and for years afterward. The candles burned down. The musicians packed their instruments. And somewhere in the palace that night, in a room that looked out over the city of London, a woman who had spent weeks watching quietly finally allowed herself to rest. Not because the evening had gone as planned, but because the evening had confirmed something she had needed to know before she could trust the weight she was about to place on another person's shoulders. The realm needed someone beside her who could not be bought, who did not perform loyalty but simply possessed it, who had searched for her in the dark with nothing to guide him but the refusal to believe the worst. She had found that person, and she had found him not in a throne room or a formal introduction or a carefully arranged courtship supervised by advisors. She had found him in the way he left a breakfast table, in the way he canceled an engagement without explanation, in the way he carried a silk pouch in his coat pocket for 3 weeks, because he could not yet bring himself to accept that the story was over. This story ends here, but the question it leaves behind does not, because the dowager was not simply a villain in a gown. She was a woman who had spent so long measuring people by what they appeared to be that she had entirely lost the ability to see what they actually were. And that is not a failure that belongs only to 1810, or only to the English aristocracy, or only to people with titles and estates. It is a failure that is available to anyone. The question this story asks, the one it has been quietly building toward from the moment that silk pouch hit a mahogany table, is this: how many times have you stood in that ballroom, not as Adriana, not as Julian, but as the dowager, certain you had read the room correctly, certain you understood what someone was worth based on how they arrived, certain, right up until the trumpet sounded, that you were the one holding all the cards? And how many times has life unrolled its scroll and read out a name you were not prepared to hear? True nobility is not what you are given. It is what you refuse to sell. And the most powerful person in any room is never the one making the most noise. It is the one who already knows something you do not. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of something true, leave a comment below. Tell us where you are watching from. This channel is built on persistence, on stories that carry weight and leave something behind. Subscribe if you believe that the most powerful thing a person can do is simply refuse to be less than they are. We will see you in the next one. Power without wisdom always destroys itself. In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte made the mistake of surrounding himself with yes men who never told him the truth. That silence cost him an empire. The Dowager Duchess made the same mistake. She was so focused on protecting appearances that she never stopped to ask the right question about the woman standing in front of her. This story was created to show you that arrogance is not strength. It is a blindfold. The moment you stop seeing people clearly is the moment you begin losing everything you worked so hard to protect.